Let me start by welcoming everyone. It's fantastic to have you, even if we don't see you, for this new initiative and this, what we hope is one of the flagships of the department. As Laura was saying a minute ago, we were hoping when we designed it to actually be all of us together and then having a nice reception and an opportunity to network around these ideas. But of course, the world has changed on us in so many ways. But I'm actually very, very happy that the initial lecture and the speaker that we had agreed to actually participate anyway. I want to tell you a little bit about how we think about this series that comes from Laura's initiative and Laura coming to me with this idea within the broader agenda that we started last year of thinking more about how to deal with climate change. And then Laura will chair the session and introduce our inaugural speaker. So very much in the context of a department that has thought always very seriously about policy, but also very critically about development, it has become very clear in the last few years that both of these things require to also deal with the planetary threat of climate change. And because of this, as many of you might know, those of you that are more linked to the department, we have started a whole set of initiatives, including thinking about how we manage ourselves internally, but also how we can include climate change in more in our teaching. Of course, Laura and others had already included in the past, and how to start promoting a conversation, not just among ourselves, but among a broader community around how to think about not just climate change, but what does this mean to the way we frame and think about development. And in this context, we thought that having a new lecture series with some of the minds in the world that are thinking more seriously about this, both from academia, but in the future, hopefully also from social movements and from the policy world, was primarily important. In the future, we will take this as an opportunity to create conversations among ourselves, but again, to build links with colleagues and with activists, not just around us in Oxford, but also in the various parts of the Global South. So I'm very thankful to Laura for suggesting this initiative. And in a world where excitement is not always what is happening and optimism is not what is happening, I'm actually very excited that we are launching this. I'm very optimistic that it will create a very useful and nice conversation. So Laura, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Diego. And thank you so much, Arun, for being our first speaker. I cannot think of anyone better than you to start this series. You did history as an undergraduate at New Delhi. Then you moved on to do a master's in development administration and public policy. Then you moved to the United States, where you did a master's and a PhD in political science at Duke. But I'm not the only one to have adopted you as an anthropologist and not just as a political scientist. Like so many social scientists who is passionate about fieldwork, about empirical data, about working with real people in real situation, you have become an anthropologist from day one, I think, especially from all the work you did with these migrant pastoralists. And what else can I say? There is so much you have achieved. You're a role model for all of us. I mean, for so many years, from a very, very early age on, you thought about human ecology in terms of development, and you thought about development in terms of environmental issues. And so your work does not separate issues of development from issues of political economy, from issues of political ecology. And this is why we all read you with so much pleasure. It is about environmental politics, but environmental politics that are relevant in the global south, that are relevant for the big issues of development. And this is why you are also the chief editor of World Development at the moment. In 2006, you received a MacArthur Foundation grant, and you have had 2 very large NSF grants. From your work, I mean, there are 2 works that make you very much an anthropologist to me, although all of it does in many ways, but extraordinary what you said about indigenous knowledge. I mean, very early on, you were able to take on this debate in the policy world, in development studies. What is indigenous knowledge? What kind of a science is it? And to this day, this work has inspired me. And then in 2005, your book on environmentality, technologies of government and making of subjects, again showed so very clearly how we can use Foucault in more intelligent ways than just unearthing a development discourse, and how people are so creative, using even things that might look in adversary to them in order to turn them around, in order to show that development doesn't have to come to the expense of forest conservation. So thank you very much, Arun. We are so delighted to have you here. It's in the virtual world, but in a few years' time, as soon as we can travel again, we will make sure you do come to Oxford in real life. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much for those kind words. And Diego, thank you so much for both creating this series, both you and Laura creating the series, and for inviting me to speak in it. I regret greatly that I cannot be there in person, and that our life worlds are so circumscribed at the current moment, but also have a lot of hope that this situation, dark as it seems from day to day, is not going to last for too much longer, despite all the best efforts of our political leaders to keep us in this situation. When their charge and their objectives should be diametrically opposed to what many of them are currently doing. I am also sorry that I cannot see members of the audience in person. I just took a very, very quick look at the list of names, and I recognize some of them, both through their work and some of you because you have sent articles to World Development and published in World Development. So I want to thank you very much, both for the kind of work you do and for the engagements that have enabled our paths even to cross tangentially and to the extent that they have. I want to say also that a lot of what you said, Laura, was overblown, but to reflect a little bit before I start on my talk about the limited effect that our works have. You mentioned the article in Development and Change on indigenous knowledge. And that was, yeah, roughly about 25 years ago. But just yesterday in a faculty meeting that we were having on Zoom, again, obviously, one of our colleagues, there's a lot of discussion right now on questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, on Black Lives Matter in the United States, and the universities are not immune to those discussions. And there's a lot of both articulate expressions by our students for the need for the university and our department to do a lot more on questions and on themes of diversity and equity and inclusion, and also some responsiveness among university administrators to do so. So it was one of the topics in our faculty meeting yesterday. And we were talking about how we can, there's this phrase which I think may also be getting used in the UK on decolonizing the curriculum. And one of the scientists in our group, so our faculty is a group of ecologists and social scientists and atmospheric scientists, so a very diverse faculty in terms of the composition. And one of the scientists in our faculty said, but how can we decolonize the curriculum? And I teach about landscapes and I teach about ecologies, and to include views of Native Americans in this is not going to be possible because we are talking about science and they didn't have science. The Native Americans didn't have science. And I almost couldn't believe that, one, that this statement was made. Two, it was made in a large meeting in front of all the other faculty. And three, that this person felt comfortable saying this as a serious statement. So I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done for many of us, for us in general, to move away from habits of thought that were formed at a time that we are trying to leave behind. Uh, And that goes not just for how we think about indigenous knowledge or about government or about development or about sustainability, but the many different ways in which they intersect and the ways in which it is important for us to both explore and understand these intersections. And some of what I'm going to talk about today about the relationship between social assistance and climate resilience really comes from that perspective about the need for us to think about the relationships among the subjects and the topics that we are most comfortable exploring and thinking about, and those that we believe are either tangential or unrelated to what we are doing, but which have a very close connection and which have a very reasonable intersection with what we are doing in our own work. So what I'm going to do is share my screen with you. And let's make sure that I have the right presentation to share. Okay, so one of the things that I should just say is that when I share the screen, the Zoom window becomes very small, but it still may at times overlap with some of the text I have in my presentation. So I may stop at times, seemingly without reason. But the reason is essentially that I'm trying to move the Zoom window around on my screen to be sure that I know what I'm saying based on the presentation. Laura said to me that the presentation lasts for about an hour. I don't think I have ever given a talk that has been an hour long. I find it hard to speak for, I think like all academics, I find it very easy to speak, and given a chance, I talk at length. But still, speaking coherently for an hour is a tall order, and I will probably only speak for about 30 or 35 minutes. And I think this webinar format prevents you from asking any questions while I'm talking, but I hope that you will use the chat function or send messages to Laura or Diego for any questions that this might bring up. Some of what I say about social assistance is likely to be very familiar to you. And so really the main, I'll nonetheless elaborate a little bit on it so that it describes some of what we are doing in this project on the relationship between climate resilience and social assistance. The project started about, and it's not even a project. I should say the collaboration that I'm involved in for this project it's a joint effort with IIED and three people there, Andy Norton, Claire Shakya, and Anki Kaur, have been very closely involved in the work that I will present. And although I can't blame them for any of the deficiencies in what I'm going to talk about, a lot of the ideas that I will present, and some of the empirical evidence that I will present, has been developed in consultation and in discussions with them. So the outline of the presentation is relatively straightforward. I will just very briefly discuss or describe the sustainability/climate challenge to development. And then the next two three parts of what I talk may be familiar to at least some of you because it's about social assistance and its different forms. Uh, and then just briefly why social assistance is relevant in the context of climate change and climate change impacts. And then what are the effects of social assistance when it comes to climate? What are the types of effects? What's the scale of effects that social assistance has had in relation to development? And then I'll talk about two case studies very briefly of cash transfers and employment guarantees, and then finally conclude with what kind of work or what are some of the challenges in connecting social assistance to climate resilience, both conceptually and empirically. So I think we are all familiar with the kinds of studies and the kinds of reports that highlight how climate change and climate change risks pose a major challenge to development. We all know and are familiar with the argument and with the suggestion that the worst effects of climate risks already fall upon and will fall on even more insistently on the most vulnerable of the societies and social groups. The World Bank estimates that more than 100 million people will be thrust back into poverty by 2030 if climate risks are left unaddressed. Another study suggests the numbers of people that will be thrust back into poverty is upwards of 700 million by 2050 if we do not address climate risks. And, and these numbers just point to the severity and the scale of the climate challenge over the last 3 decades. Perhaps about a similar number has been lifted out of poverty using a very how should I say uh, flexible or lenient notion of what poverty means, $1.90 of income and of consumption or expenditure per day. So even defined very leniently in this manner, a large number of people, very large number of people will be made poor because of climate risks if they are left unaddressed. Similarly, another study suggests more than 140 million people will be are threatened with displacement because of climate change. So the gains of development that have been secured through a whole variety of instruments, among them social protection or social assistance being a major instrument whose effectiveness has been highlighted in perhaps hundreds of impact evaluation studies. Uh, so some of those substantial part of those gains is likely to be dissipated because of climate risks. So, which is why thinking about how some instruments can simultaneously address both the risks that climate poses to vulnerable groups and the development outcomes in which donors, governments, researchers are interested, how instruments that can simultaneously address both of these goals are so important. And that's the context in which I am talking, or I'll be talking about social assistance in this presentation. So what is social assistance? Again, this is perhaps not preaching to the choir, but perhaps bringing close to Newcastle. It's a rights or outcome-oriented public effort. That's the basis of social assistance. It seeks to transfer resources to the poor and to the vulnerable. That's the mechanism for it to bring about the goal at which it aims, which is to improve the well-being, reduce the vulnerability, enhance opportunities and social status of those who are marginalized or those who suffer deprivation. And there are three major contemporary forms of social assistance, and these differ by context. We all also know that customary forms of social assistance are critical, have been critical historically, continue to be really important in many communities, in many contexts, but they're declining in importance and relevance as national governments assume a substantial part of the burden of social support to those who need it. More formal forms are becoming and have become more important in terms of addressing some of the forms of marginality that the deprived or poor, that the deprived or the poor suffer. But the three basic or major forms of social assistance: formal social assistance, the transfers or which are non-contributory forms, either in cash or in kind, or through employment benefits in public work schemes, provision of food. So these are all some forms of transfers in cash or in kind. Social insurance, which is targeted to people in particular categories, whether they are old or whether they are sick. The non-contributory forms of social insurance can also be viewed as a second form of social assistance. And the third form are different kinds of labor market programs, widespread in the rich world, but even in the lower and middle income world, labor market programs in many cases provide unemployment benefits. They support the reskilling, terrible word, but useful nonetheless, reskilling of those in the labor market whose current jobs are becoming, let's say, obsolete, or provision of different kinds of employment guarantees. And they vary both in terms of the levels of such guarantees and the amount and types of benefits that such guarantees provide. So there are these three major forms of social assistance, and I'll focus primarily in the case studies on cash transfers and on a public works / employment guarantee program. What links social assistance and climate resilience? When it comes to poor and middle income countries, there's a commonality in their goals. Both social assistance and efforts at climate resilience seek to address the deprivation and vulnerability and poverty of those who are destitute or those who are marginalized. The second aspect of the relationship is really about the complementarity between social assistance and climate resilience. The scope and breadth of social assistance programs has grown enormously over the last 3 decades, and I will present some information on that. Compared to efforts at climate resilience. So despite the commonality in goals, the scale and breadth of social assistance versus climate resilience efforts is very different. And to the extent that there's some overlap in the effectiveness of social assistance programs and climate resilience goals, there is the possibility of complementary work on these two different sets of programs, two different types of programs. The third aspect that links social assistance and climate resilience is the existing infrastructure of implementation for social assistance programs. So I think one can safely say that the coverage of social assistance efforts, whatever form you take, is very patchy, and there are many poor and many of those who receive benefits through social assistance programs don't, or the levels of benefits they receive is inadequate. Nonetheless, the scale and breadth of these programs means that the infrastructure for implementing them is enormously greater, many times more widespread compared to efforts to address climate risks and climate resilience. And this becomes especially important as climate risks escalate, assume civilizational scale proportions, assume threats that are civilization scale, and need addressing if we are to continue to secure some gains in development towards poverty reduction or reducing hunger and so forth. So what is the scale and breadth of these programs? So regionally, these programs are roughly about the table just gives you a sense of the regional distribution of the scale of these programs and what's the outlay. These numbers are all in purchasing power parity terms, dollars, and they are in 2011 dollars, and they're based on some essentially simple arithmetic using World Bank data on social assistance expenditures. And so roughly about 2.5 billion people are covered by social assistance programs of different forms across the major lower and middle income regions of the world, and about $500 billion are being spent in lower and middle income countries on social assistance programs. One can also think of these expenditures by types of programs. And if you again do some very simple arithmetic to look at what's the outlay on these different types of programs, cash transfers comprise roughly around $200 billion in expenditures. Public works programs are smaller, maybe by now about $50 billion. And then pensions, school feeding programs are another $150 billion or so. And then finally, there's some, the in-kind transfers add up to $125, $130 billion. So substantial aggregate amounts, but in terms of per capita benefits to households or individuals in lower middle income countries, they still are much, much smaller than what we are familiar with as the scope of social protection efforts in richer countries, whether it is Europe or North America. And these figures provide you a sense of the distribution of the scope and breadth of social assistance programs in terms of aggregate expenditures for this slide. And you can see that there is significant variation in the total expenditures across different countries. And you see the total amount of social spending, spending on social protection across different countries. And because these include the rich countries, I've just called it social protection because that's a much more widespread form of assistance in the richer world. And then the spending on public works / employment guarantee and different kinds of cash transfer programs. And this just gives you the same information, but by per capita expenditures. So you can see that the per capita expenditures is just because the amounts are so large in the rich world, we have a scale that goes from 0 to 2,000 or more. And just because the amounts are so much smaller in the lower and middle income world, the scale goes from 0 to 25 or 0 to 100 in terms of the per capita expenditures. So what can we say about the effectiveness of these programs in addressing climate resilience? So we distinguished in this research among 3 kinds of climate resilience, 3 types of climate resilience outcomes. We talked about absorptive, adaptive, and transformative outcomes. And absorptive outcomes correspond to the common and early definitions or early understandings of resilience, which was the capacity of a system to return to its prior function, prior activities, prior state after experiencing a shock. So absorptive resilience is the form of resilience that for which we see the most evidence in existing research as an outcome of social assistance efforts. The adaptive resilience is the idea that social ecological systems that experience a disturbance or that undergo some stress not only are able to return or to assume their prior level of functioning or prior level of, let's say, well-being in the context of social systems, but are able to do so in a way that allows them to cope better, allows them to adapt better with to the kinds of risks that they are experiencing. And we found some evidence for that also in a systematic review that we did. I think the word meta-analysis is incorrect here. Systematic review we did of studies that looked at how social assistance, social protection programs enable some form of adaptation. We found much less evidence for transformative resilience, which we defined as the capacity of a system or households or social ecological system or households, not only to absorb shocks, but also to change form or to create capacities that would withstand higher levels or more frequent shocks, more frequent environmental stresses. So we found relatively little evidence for this in the systematic review that we did of work on social systems. We did a case study of cash transfer programs, more than 125 lower, and this is made possible because of the very large number of studies that have sought to identify what kind of effects cash transfers are producing. So as I was already saying earlier, a very large number of countries have adopted some form of a cash transfer program, either in its conditional or in its unconditional variant. And in some isolated instances of universal basic incomes that have lasted typically for a relatively short amount of time. So more than 125 countries have adopted these. There has been a remarkable growth since the early 1990s. The outlays on these programs have gone from roughly about $25 billion in 1992 to $125 billion, $150 billion today. And much of the evidence that we saw, and I'll elaborate on that in just a second, supports, again, the idea that these social assistance programs in the form of cash transfers enable both absorptive and some adaptive resilience. There's much less evidence of transformative resilience occurring as a result of these programs. And I should say that much of this conclusion is based really on associations between observed outcomes and the intervention, less on widespread experimental evidence on the effects of these programs. And much of the result on absorptive resilience in particular is through the support for consumption expenditures that cash transfers provide, especially for the very poor. I should also add that most of the studies that we currently possess on effects of cash transfers focus on social well-being outcomes. There's very, very little work on how cash transfers affect environmental or climate adaptation outcomes. So the natural question you'd ask is, if they don't focus on climate adaptation or climate resilience outcomes, how can we conclude that cash transfers are producing absorptive or adaptive resilience? So I'll turn to that in just a moment after I talk about the second case study, which is the employment guarantee efforts of public works or wage labor efforts. So these are less widely distributed, less ubiquitous than cash transfers. The largest of these programs is being implemented in India. It is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Has a long history dating back to the colonial period, if one wants to trace, perhaps even pre-colonial period, if one wants to trace its ancestry, and is located in the efforts to provide employment during periods of natural disasters such as famines. So the British colonial state was well recognized for providing people with work, often around public works programs such as road building or creation of canals, construction of canals, and providing some wages to people who worked on these efforts. And these were the kinds of conditions attached to work varied substantially depending on the fiscal health of the colonial state and on the intensity of the famine. But a lot of the examples of different kinds of public works and wage labor schemes in India can be traced back to this. And the MNREGA, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, has now expanded these efforts into a federal program, which I'm sure most of you know about. But similar programs of public works and guarantees are also present in a number of other countries. Again, as I said, not at the same scale as that in South Asia, but certainly in many ex-British colonies in sub-Saharan Africa, and in some countries in Latin America, you also see employment guarantee or public works schemes. And in the Indian case, the public work or employment guarantee is accompanied by not just the remuneration for wage labor is accompanied by support for strengthening local institutions and for trying to create new employment skills, new skills, job skills among beneficiaries, although these are smaller components of the of Manrega. And obviously the wage labor is aimed at creating rural infrastructure of different kinds. And these include natural infrastructure, that is tree planting programs or programs to increase soil fertility or reduce soil erosion, but also uh, 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 different kinds of public works such as canals and roads. And what we find again in these programs is that there is significant evidence that suggests these programs strengthen absorptive resilience, but not, and to some extent adaptive resilience, but not transformative resilience. So how can we say that these programs are strengthening these different kinds of resilience? So we look at the different indicators along which effectiveness or effects of social assistance programs are measured. And these fall into a whole range of different categories, but they are the conventional indicators that we often think of as development outcome indicators. So they focus on nutrition, on caloric intake and consumption, income, both, and then the increases in both productive and non-productive assets, changes in health status and literacy and education, and then at the community level on incidence of crimes, changes in local economy, levels of migration, creation of different kinds of climate resilience assets, the changes in occupational structure, development of infrastructure that is resilient to climate impacts, changes in ecosystems. All of these are indicators that that have been used to assess the effects of social assistance. So when we think about these indicators, however, and we look at studies of resilience, not studies of resilience, climate resilience that are looking at social assistance, but studies of climate resilience that are focusing on climate resilience outcomes, they use very similar indicators. They use the same indicators of changes in income, changes in assets, improvements in levels of consumption, changes in literacy and education. And so this is the basis on which one can make general arguments about the outcomes, the resilience outcomes of social assistance programs, that many of the changes, indicated changes that we see and which are used as conventional indicators of, I should say, development or economic outcomes, because they overlap to a substantial extent with resilience outcome indicators, we can say something about the extent to which social assistance enables climate resilience or different forms of climate resilience and the types of climate resilience that it does not enable. But to really, and this is where I think we have a conceptual challenge in front of us to really understand the mechanisms through which social assistance enables climate resilience, we would need to assess the extent to which social assistance interventions change or affect the features, the resilience features of social systems such as households and communities. There are 6 major features of resilience whose presence or whose presence is associated with variations in forms and levels, types and levels of resilience: modularity, redundancy, networking, diversity, learning, and self-organization. And I think what we can say is that, so the first thing I should say is that even in the literature on resilience, we don't have a clear mapping of these different features of resilience to the 3 types of resilience outcomes: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, that I mentioned. So the first task, or first conceptual task, or task for empirical research, is to identify, or is to think about how these different features of resilience relate to different types of resilience outcomes. So one could say, for example, that learning and self-organization are likely associated with transformative resilience outcomes. Whereas redundancy, which is what one could interpret the improvement in consumption or incomes and productive slash non-productive assets to be linked to. So improvements in redundancy likely lead to absorptive resilience, but we haven't seen, or we don't have sufficient research that would allow us to make those kind of judgments, except posing them as hypotheses and investigating the extent to which this does in fact happen, that these changes in resilience outcomes are the result of changes in resilience features of social and social ecological systems. So I think this is the major challenge that remains in front of us. We could make some informed judgments, or we could think about how these, or the extent to which these are happening as a result of social assistance programs, the extent to which you are seeing changes in the nature of social systems in terms of their modularity, or in terms of the networking relationships or communication among members of the system, the extent to which there's greater diversity in these systems, but we don't have reliable systematic evidence on these outcomes, on the outcomes in terms of how social assistance affects the resilience features of households and communities. We do have relatively clear sense of how resilience outcomes are being influenced, but it would make a lot more. We would have a lot more reliable sense of how social assistance or any other development program affects resilience if you also knew the mechanism or the pathways through which assistance leads to changes in resilience. So what are some of the challenges in linking social assistance to climate resilience? So apart from the conceptual and evidence gaps that I just described, we can also say that despite these programs being present in many countries, there's still substantial patchiness in the coverage of households that need social assistance, and in the levels of support that these programs provide. There's limited coordination at best across different implementation actors and agencies in the countries where they're being implemented. And there's very little coordination across different sectoral programs, which prevents these programs from achieving their potential in terms of supporting greater levels of climate resilience. And we have a set of ideas about how one could strengthen the effectiveness of these programs, apart from growing increases in the levels of support for social assistance. We know from some work on conditional versus unconditional cash transfer programs that where you have conditions imposed, despite some possibilities of crowding, we see improved outcomes along the dimension in which there is a condition. We don't yet have systematic evidence on whether overall levels of well-being are greater for conditional cash transfer programs rather than unconditional cash transfers. But we do have evidence that the dimension on which you have the condition, for example, children going to school, or visits to clinics, or health out, like the dimension for which you have the condition, those dimensions seem to be enhanced by the presence of conditions in cash transfers. But we don't know if that is also associated with overall improvements in well-being through conditions attached to transfers versus unconditional transfers. We clearly need more careful research on the climate and ecosystem outcomes of social assistance, and partly through an assessment of how and the pathways through which social assistance leads to changes in levels of resilience. And we need improved coordination across different actors and agencies and sectors. So I'm going to stop there, I think, and let me stop sharing my screen. I think, Laura, this was not quite an hour, more like 35 minutes or so, but it gives us more time for questions, since this is very much a project that is in development, and I would like to hear suggestions and criticisms and ideas that can help me improve what I'm doing. Thank you, and help IIED improve what they're doing. Thank you.